Good to see everybody this evening. Glad that you're with us and glad that you're able to be here. We are tonight looking at the little book of Habakkuk. And it is the next of the minor prophets that we did not get to study. I was able to give to many of you, and maybe some of you noticed it on the podium in the foyer, there is an outline for Habakkuk done in the same format that we've done the Wednesday night studies on the minor prophets. One of the things that needed to be adjusted in starting our big picture study this last Wednesday night was we weren't quite done with our minor prophet study. And so what I've chosen to do is I will be covering the minor prophets over the next few times that I speak on Sunday nights. So it'll take us 2 or 3 months to finish them out. But I did want to complete that study, and I will give an outline each time I do that, and it'll be in the same format that we had. So if you're keeping track of those and keeping them in a folder or whatever, you can certainly do that. And so we plan to do that together. One of the things, of course, Habakkuk is one of those, big word, hard to say. Amy, when she was a kid at the church she grew up in Maryland, they would do scripture drills, and they would teach them how to spell some of the tougher ones in the Bible. And here's what they did with this one. They would spell as fast as they could, but here's what you do. It's H and an A, B and an A, K and a K, and a U and a K. So you want to know how to spell Habakkuk? H and an A, B and an A, K and a K, U and a K. Can you say that real fast? I won't ask you to. But anyway, a lot of times good memory device is good for learning those things. It highlights to me, again, what we're looking at on Wednesday nights. You know, this last Wednesday night, we started the book in the big picture, and we're looking at the beauty and the wonder of our Bible. And we're trying to learn some things about it and trying to learn the overview of it. And one of the things we said Wednesday night, we talked about the Old Testament versus the New Testament. And one of the things that's important, we don't live under the old law. We don't follow the things in the Old Testament. So why is it still in our Bible, and why do we study it? Why do we do sermons on it? Why are we bothering to look at Habakkuk tonight? And the answer is like we mentioned toward the end of class in Galatians 3, that the old law was our schoolmaster, our guardian, our tutor, that taught us and brought us to a better understanding of God. And this lesson tonight in Habakkuk, I think, is a good example of one of the gems you find in the Old Testament. You know, we sometimes think, okay, wouldn't it be great if we could ask God a question? If you could just literally call God up on the phone and ask Him a question. And, we don't have that opportunity. We can pray to Him. We can read His Bible and see what it says. But some of the individuals in the Old Testament were able to have a face-to-face, or at least through God speaking in His inspiration, have a dialogue with God. And Habakkuk is one of those individuals. The book of Habakkuk, as we see in Habakkuk 1 verse 1, says, the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw, the Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity? Why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise, so the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. Wow, Habakkuk asks a tough question, doesn't he? How long, O Lord, are you going to let all this go on? Your law, your righteousness, it's getting clobbered down here. Your people are getting beaten. This iniquity's going on. How long are you going to sit idly by? When you first think about that, I think, okay, does God know what's going on? Well, the answer is yes, God knows what's going on. We recognize that God understands, that God knows, that God hears and God sees, and God cares and God pours out His compassion. And so this book is a little different in the sense that it starts with Habakkuk initiating the contact to God. He throws out this question. You might call it even a prayer. He throws this out to God. God, how long are you going to let this go on? Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever prayed that prayer? Well, that's a pretty honest prayer, isn't it? How long, O Lord, are you going to let this go on? So Habakkuk said that to God. And here's God's response, is the next thing that comes up. God's response is, look among the nations and see. Wonder and be astounded. For I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march to the breadth of the earth, to seize dwellings not their own. Let's stop there. What was the oppression that Habakkuk was dealing with? What was so bad in his day and time? Habakkuk probably wrote this somewhere in the time of about 640 to 615 BC. If you can remember back to that, that's roughly the same time that Nahum wrote, the book that we just looked at previous. Nahum wrote a book prophesying about the downfall and destruction of Assyria. Assyria, the capital of Assyria was Nineveh. And back in the train up just a little bit further, you go back about another 100 years before, and there was another prophet that went to Nineveh. Remember who that was? It was Jonah. Jonah went to Nineveh, and when Jonah went 100 or so years before this time, Jonah went to Nineveh, preached his 8-word sermon that in 40 days Nineveh will perish, and Nineveh repented. And Nineveh repented from the top to the bottom. Everybody repented. And that was all good for a while. And they turned back away from God. They began to live and act in ways that they shouldn't. And they went back to those ways. And then we saw the book of Nahum that we looked at here a couple weeks ago in our Wednesday evening study. And Nahum said that basically now it's time. You're going to be destroyed. And roughly Nahum probably wrote his book around 10 to 20 years, maybe even before Habakkuk. And there was only 20 to 40 years or so that Nahum wrote before the destruction of Nineveh and the destruction of the Assyrians. And so the Assyrians were some really bad people. When you stop to realize that if you have ever studied in any depth the ancient world, the Assyrians were quite literally some of the worst. They were some of the worst people that have ever lived. They in their brutality would be certainly matched with what took place in World War II and what has taken place, with the extermination of the Jews by way of the Germans, and the way that they acted brutally. They did so in the ancient world. The wickedness and the brutality of the Assyrians in that day and time, certainly, maybe not in numbers of people, but certainly was on the level of the brutality of some of the worst nations that have ever been on the planet. And so probably if you looked at a top 10 of the worst nations on the planet for their brutality and their wickedness, Assyria is probably going to make it somewhere in that list. Just a really, really bad group of people. A lot of times people talk about the term Babylon or the nation Babylon and talk about its wickedness. And Babylon really, quite frankly, wasn't as bad as Assyria. The Babylonians were the ones that were going to take over the Assyrians. If you look in the text, he says in verse 6 that God's raising up a nation, the Chaldeans. Well, the Chaldeans those were the Babylonians. We call them Babylonians today. In fact, today we call them Iraqis. But the Babylonians were the Chaldeans, and they were going to take over Assyria. And it was going to be, Babylon was going to be the world power that was rising up. And the Babylonians were going to punish the Assyrians for the wickedness and the brutality that they had brought upon all the nations at large. The Assyrians in particular had taken over the northern kingdom of Israel, had taken them and destroyed that nation, and you might say, didn't kill everybody necessarily, but scattered them all throughout the nations and really put an end to the nation of Israel as a nation itself. And so now the Babylonians are going to take them over, and then a few years later, 100 or so years later, it's going to be later in 722, it is going to be in 500s, it's going to be Babylon that's going to take over the southern kingdom of Judah. But the Babylonians, as ruthless as they could be, weren't nearly as nasty as the Assyrians. The Babylonians, what they often did is they took over a nation and then took captives. And that's a much friendlier thing than killing them. If you remember, and it's something we've looked at some of the other minor prophets, it's something you remember from the story of Daniel, that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were taken into captivity in Babylon by the Babylonians, but they all got government jobs, if you remember. They all became workers in the government, so they all got government jobs, government stipends, and what have you. And so, if you're going to get taken over, taken to a foreign country and given a government job, in the broad scheme of things, isn't all that bad compared to what the Assyrians would do by cutting you up into pieces. I guess between those alternatives, it's a lot better. Well, anyway, Habakkuk cries out, "How long, O Lord, are you going to let this go by?" And God says, "I've got something in the works. I've got a nation I'm raising up. I'm raising up the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, and I'm raising them up to punish the Assyrians." About them, verse 7, "They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards. They're more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour." In the ancient world, horses and horsemen and cavalry were the elite strong forces. We today, what do? We've got our Air Force. The Air Force is what is so swift and fast and can drop things and destroy. In that day and time, obviously before flight, the fastest thing on the planet in that day and time that a person could be a part of was a horse. And so the nations that were the strongest and most powerful got the fastest horses. And certainly, that part of the world is where they use the horses first. Even today, some of the fastest horses on the planet are Arabian horses, even known for their great speed. And so the horses that they used were very fearsome and strong and powerful. And so they're going to come in, and they're going to sweep in like eagles, and they're going to attack. So Habakkuk gives that first complaint, asks God about that. You come down to verse 12. You skip down to verse 12, and then Habakkuk continues his thoughts. He says, "Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die, O Lord. You have ordained them as a judgment. And you, O Rock, have established them for reproof. You who are purer eyes than to see evil, cannot look at wrong. Why do you idly look at traitors and are silent when the wicked swallows up the man more than righteous than he. You make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with a net. He gathers them in the dragnet, so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and makes offerings to his dragnet. For by them he lives in luxury, and his food is rich. Is he then on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? Verse 1 of chapter 2. I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me and what I shall answer concerning my complaints. Now, it's a little easy to miss what Habakkuk is actually saying. You know, Habakkuk, to rewind, made the complaint to God, how long are you going to let this happen? Then God says, I got it covered. I'm paraphrasing it, obviously, but I've got it covered. I'm sending a nation to you. I'm sending the Babylonians, and they're going to come in, and they're going to swoop in on the Assyrians, and they're going to take care of them. And Habakkuk looks at that, and he's like, but you're using one bad nation to destroy another bad nation. And he asks at the end of that, how long are nations going to, how long are the mercilessly killing nations forever? Are you going to keep punishing one nation with another nation and then punish that nation with another nation all throughout history? And another tough question, isn't it, that Habakkuk is asking. He's asking them, he's asking God, how long is this going to go on? Well, of course, God, makes his own choices. But what you can notice, and I guess this points toward the lessons that we have that you can find on the back page of your outline, some of the lessons that God sometimes uses unrighteous nations to do his work, to do his bidding. Because, trust me, even though the Babylonians are better than the Assyrians, they're still really, really wicked people. Babylon is not known for a bastion of righteousness. They are a very wicked group, a group that certainly does a lot of things that we would disapprove of, that God disapproved of. And if you fast forward it, even during Daniel's day, the Babylonians are overtaken by the Medo-Persians. And the Medo-Persians that come along, Darius, the king that had Daniel thrown into the lion's den, was a Medo-Persian king. Whole other empire. There was a different regime change during the time that Daniel was in Babylon. And so a new kingdom arose, and that was the Medo-Persians. Well, the answer with all this is that as long as people continue in wickedness, their time's short. If you perpetrate wickedness, you might have your day in the sun. The Assyrians had their day in the sun, had their time that they were at the top of the heap, and everybody came to them, and they, a lot of the nations of the world paid them tribute and taxes and all that, and they conquered a bunch of folks, but they had their day that they suffered. The Babylonians, same thing. The Medo-Persians, same thing. And if you look through the rest of the history of that time frame, after the Medo-Persians arise the Greeks, after the Greeks rise the Romans, and then you come over into the New Testament. And so nations have risen up and fallen all throughout human history, and God has on different occasions used different nations to punish the wicked nations. They don't necessarily have to be good nations that do the punishing, but realize that God in his sovereignty, God in his power, and God in his might can use even the wicked to do his will and to bring about his cause. And also, as we recognize that no nation rises or no nation falls without God at least giving the okay for such a thing to happen. You flip through to chapter 2, and we look through chapter 2, and you notice that God answers him in verse 2 and following. And he points out in verses 2 through 5, he says, "And the Lord answered me, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith." The righteous shall live by faith. "Moreover, wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who is never at rest. His greed is as wide as Sheol. His death he has never enough. He gathers for himself all nations and collects as his own all peoples." If you think about it a minute, if you're in our Bible class in the auditorium this morning, this fits very well into it. The passage we looked at in 2 Corinthians 4 about us having treasure in earthen vessels, and then he goes on to talk about that we're surrounded, that we're perplexed but not destroyed, we're persecuted but not abandoned, and all of the difficulties that are around us, that even though Satan's given us his greatest shots, we're still standing. And even though the world is a dangerous place, it's a dangerous place today. It was a dangerous place in the 7th century BC, like when Habakkuk lived. But you know what the answer was? The righteous will be able to live by their faith. The righteous will survive. The righteous will thrive. The righteous will make it because of their faith. That's been true in Habakkuk's day. It was true in Abraham's day. It was true back in Noah's day. It was true in the New Testament, and it's true today. The righteous people live by their faith in God. And so, with that in mind, you have this next section, this latter part of chapter 2, that we will largely skip over, but I want to draw some things out of it. It is the woe placed to the Chaldeans. Okay? So notice our progression. We go from Habakkuk crying out for help, and then crying out for help, the help is going to be the Chaldeans. They're going to come in and punish the Assyrians. And Habakkuk cries out and says, well, that's all fine and good, but what's going to happen to the Chaldeans, essentially? Because they're not much better. And God says the righteous will live by his faith in any and all times. And then God pronounces a woe upon the Chaldeans, upon the ones that are getting ready to take over and punish the Assyrians. But God pronounces woes upon them because of their list of sins. And he goes through a lot of those things, and if we had more time, we could itemize those and go down through them. But they do all kinds of things to harm and to get their neighbor to sin. They cause their neighbor to get drunk, as he tells about in verse 15, so that their neighbor can be compromised. They can view upon their nakedness, and they cause them to go to shame and to go to shameful things. And talks about the violence that they're bringing upon the other nations. And then you come down through and look at verse 18 and following, 18 through 20, at the end of chapter 2. And he says, "What profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it? A metal image, a teacher of lies. For its maker trusts in its own creation when he makes speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake to a silent stone. Arise, can this teach? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath in it at all. Now I got a question. What's greater? Something that's made or the individual that made it? Well, I think in all contexts, I think people are going to recognize that the maker is greater than what's made. And if nothing else, the maker can just simply make something else to replace it. And you think about the folly of the people around the world that would worship an idol that they or somebody else made. You know, you're the one that formed it. You're the one that carved it. You're the one that put it in place. You're the one that picks it up and carries it if it has to be moved. And you look to it as your God. And what a silly thing it is to look at a chunk of wood, to look at a chunk of silver or gold or whatever, and look at it for anything when you're the one that is the maker, the molder, the changer of it. And with all of this, through these 2 chapters, you've got Habakkuk that has asked these questions, these big, tough questions in life. And you come to the end of God's response here in chapter 2, and God finishes out his response to Habakkuk and says in verse 20, "But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him." There are very few passages anywhere that are more powerful than that one. When you look at the ramifications and you realize the power and the majesty and the glory and the might that's wrapped up in that verse. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let everybody else be quiet. Let all the rest of the world be silent before him. The chunks of rock and wood and gold and silver don't have anything to say. Whatever nation, whether it be the Assyrians, whether it be the Chaldeans, whether it be Judah, they got nothing to say. We have a whole lot more need to listen than we would ever have to speak before the Almighty God. The Lord is in his holy temple. God has not left his desk. God has not gone on a vacation. God has not stepped aside. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let the whole world keep silent before him. Chapter 3, briefly, is a prayer that Habakkuk prays. It is a prayer of praise. Habakkuk gets it. He realizes what God has done. He realizes what God is going to do. And he talks about some of the different nations and how God has judged them and how God is going to judge them. He talks about the salvation that God is going to bring upon them. He like I say, he lists several of the nations that God has dealt with, along the way, and how God has rescued Israel out of those. I want to read briefly verse 11 and some things following there as we close out. It says, "The sun and the moon stood in their place at the light of your arrows as they sped, at the flash of your glittering spear. You marched to the earth in fury. You threshed the nations in anger, and you went out from the salvation of your people for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. You pierced with his own arrows the heads of the warriors. You came like a whirlwind to scatter me, rejoicing as if to devour the poor in secret. You trampled the sea with your horses, the singing of your mighty waters. I hear and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me, yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us." You think the Chaldeans were tough? You read that description of what God brings. You think a few fast horses or something. About how that God brings down His judgment, brings down His power upon the people. The last 3 verses, the chapter, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, the fields yet yield no field, the flock be cut off from the fold, there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. If nothing is here, if all the prosperity is gone, everything's plundered, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on high places, to the choir master with the stringed instruments. You have the beginning of this book. Habakkuk calls out, how long, O Lord, are you going to let us keep getting clobbered? And he ends by singing a praise to the God of his salvation. God answered him and showed him that I'm going to take care of it. And whatever difficulty, whatever challenge, whatever trouble we have in this life, we cry out to God for His help. He'll be there to listen, to know, and to care. And He can give us the joy and the assurance and the knowledge that, you know what? No matter how messed up this world gets, and if you've watched the news of any sort in recent times about what all is going on over in the Middle East with ISIS, and oh, by the way, North Korea is acting up again, and then you've got the things in our own nation, and that doesn't even count all the unrest that's going on in Africa and the things that are going on there. And then, oh, by the way, we've got the cartels down in Mexico and Central America. The world's in a mess. And no matter how messed up it gets, the Lord is in His holy temple. And all the world needs to keep silent before Him. The righteous will live by faith. And the salvation always will belong to the Lord. The messages in Habakkuk's messed up, out of control day is the same thing for our messed up and out of control 2016. It's amazing. Why we study such a book is because, you know what? You could change the names and put some of the modern countries' names in place in Habakkuk and stick it out there and change the wording a little bit, and people would think it was a news story straight off of the news today, because it's the same way it goes. If you're not a Christian, would you come tonight and give your life to Christ? Because as mixed up as this world is, you can find answers and truth in the power of the gospel. The gospel still changes lives. Jesus Christ can still save you today just the same as it's always been. You can be forgiven of all your sins if you come to Him and give Him your life. If you are a Christian and you need to seek for prayers, for strength or encouragement, for help in any way, if we can help you, please come while we stand and sing.